A few of my favorite verses in the Bible to show that perhaps it's not the best book to go to for science is actually in the New Testament, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, which often fly under the radar. We don't talk about these verses much, but it says this, "But they deliberately forget that long ago by God's word the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed." Again, that's 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Now wait, what? The earth was formed out of water and by water? And it's these same waters that flooded the earth at the time of Noah? I don't remember that in Genesis. But if we don't understand ancient creation myths from that part of the world at that time, meaning if we don't understand the context, then these verses are going to be hard to make sense of. But if we understand how ancient Israelites thought of creation, and we don't try to sync it up with modern day theories, scientific theories about the origins of the universe, we find these verses are actually consistent with the rest of the Bible, and it is there from the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, which we know these verses. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then verse 2, "Now the earth was formless and empty," or formless and void. "Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." And we often read this to say something like Genesis 1:1 says, God created everything. And then Genesis 1:2, and it was all kind of a sloppy mess, and God cleaned it up. But I've got questions, like, why would God create so much water that then God's just going to have to clean up in the following verses, when God could have just created everything kind of quote unquote right from the beginning? But to ask that question and to think about creation in that way plays into a very Greek, not a very Hebrew understanding. The understanding that God created everything out of thin air, out of nothing, or the fancy term for this is ex nihilo, out of nothing. But that, again, plays into a Greek mindset, not much the Hebrew context. And so, when I was in seminary, I had a professor read Genesis 1:1-2 out loud and asked an unsuspecting volunteer to come up and draw formless and void on the board, right? And that was a bit embarrassing to watch, because what exactly are you going to draw that has no form and is empty? Isn't that basically just saying nothing? It turns out that we should be suspicious of this translation with those two words, formless and void, or formless and empty, the Hebrew being tohu and bohu. I want to focus on these understanding of Genesis and their theological implications. So if we read Genesis 1:1 not as God created everything in Genesis 1:1, but if we read Genesis 1:1 like some sort of summary, then we'd be following what a lot of scholars think should be the case. So instead of reading Genesis 1:1 like God as some sort of infinity stone-wearing Thanos who snaps fingers and things come into existence, scholars would agree we should read Genesis 1:1 more like this. Let me tell you a story about how God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:2. Now, at the time of God's creating, the earth was a chaotic and uninhabitable wasteland. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. We're waiting with anticipation this creation event that we get in the rest of the chapter. And if we read it this way, we see that God's not creating something out of nothing per se, since there is something there before God shows up on the scene. What's there? Well, it looks like it's water. Surprise, surprise. There we find our water. And not just any water, but there's a special water. It's called the Tehom in Hebrew, translated the deep in the translation that I was just using. We see this primordial water, this Tehom, show up over and over in our Bible. It's actually mentioned 36 times throughout the Bible. It's mentioned in Genesis and Exodus, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Jonah, Habakkuk. It's everywhere if we're looking for it. It's actually everywhere even if you're not looking for it. It's there, whether you see it or not. But that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is just the theological significance of actually seeing creation in this way. Because the common way of understanding creation and God's act of creation is something that's kind of hard to relate to. It's just there. It's this brute fact. It's sort of outside of us. But when we see that the Hebrew Bible paints creation as ordering the disorder, bringing peace to the chaos of the world, holding back that which overwhelms, being created in the image of that God becomes incredibly significant and relatable. As image bearers, we are not asked to become magicians who pull rabbits out of hats, but to imitate the cosmic God on a micro scale of creation. In other words, creation in the Bible is not a scientific event. It's not a sterile event. It's a moral and ethical event. The brilliant scholar John Levinson puts it this way. He says, it seems more likely that ancient Israel identified nothing with things like disorder, injustice, subjugation, disease, and death. To them, in other words, nothing was actually something negative. When order emerges where disorder had reigned unchallenged, when justice replaces oppression, when disease and death yield to vitality and longevity, there is indeed the creation of something out of nothing. So for me, 2 Peter 3 and the myth of creation out of water is another example of why it's important not to put our own modern framework on what we expect the Bible to be. When we let it be what it is, not only are we respecting the Bible more, but we can find these beautiful theological nuggets that can inspire us to collaborate with God as co-creators of a more just and peaceful world. Until next time, may we create something out of nothing.